Chapter 16. A Courtier of the King. O burden, none is weightier than a wise head in a foreign land. To the poor, this is more valuable than any riches Havamal. The next day, when Hedwig came outside to do her laundry, she found Aldrich eagerly waiting for her. Upon the pretense of searching for a lost arrowhead in the tall grass, he greeted her cheerfully with an exciting proposition. "I'm going to give you 3 chances to guess my news." Hedwig's twig broom remained suspended in the air, dripping with water as she studied him closely. "Is it about the ship that arrived yesterday? Among the women, I had heard it was Thorkel Farserk's warship. He's just returned from his raid on the Irish coast. Will his wife be holding a feast to welcome him home? I cannot deny that you are quite the astute one. Dunstan knows he is deserving of a warm welcome. I have never seen such a sight at sea. There were more slaves than crew members on board. Each one of them had a bloody bandage, and some were missing limbs. 2 of the crew did not return at all. Their lovers had come down to the shore to greet them. When they discovered their loved ones had died, they tore their hair in agony and tried to take their own lives with knives." "That was a foolish act," replied Hedwig calmly. "It is better for their lovers to die with honor than live in the shadow of cowardice. Please tell me your news. Is there going to be a feast, and will Tove be in attendance?" "Messengers arrived early this morning from Farserk's wife, but I dare you to guess what happened next. If you don't tell me instantly, I will pour this pan of water over your head. It wouldn't bother me too much. I will be adorned in new robes of black velvet with ermine accents. Listen now, Tove has accepted the invitation. Even Valga believes this to be a miraculous event. Magnus is currently choosing out the finest attire, and Halla is selecting the most valuable gifts from those brought from Norway." Hedwig's hands stopped their work, coming together in a clap that echoed through the room. "At last they will see him," she said, "and they will know what manner of man they have treated with disrespect. I have hoped for this with all my heart, but I never thought he cared enough to do it." Aldrich shook his head. "Don't think he does this for his own honor. It's to give his mission a good appearance." Hedwig sighed as she picked up her work again. "When he begins to preach that to them, he will knock it all over again." Aldrich frowned, but he knew his lord's rank and gallant appearance commanded respect and admiration. It would be a pity when he had to undo it all. "It's harder than the martyrdom of the saints," Aldrich muttered bitterly. As they followed their lord into Thorkel Farserk's hall, Aldrich noticed the silver crucifix shining on Tove's breast, and he realized the unworthiness of his thoughts. But Tove's purposes were beyond Aldrich's understanding. He never mentioned the new religion, instead speaking of battles, feasts, and the grandeur of the Northmen. He discussed politics and famous champions with the young men, and patiently answered the women's questions about the king's house and the queen. He described weddings and burials with the skill of a minstrel and the tact of a courtier. Whispers of praise encircled the board, falling like music to the ears of Tove's followers. Haraldson watched with pride as Eric kept his face turned away, listening intently. Aldrich nervously whispered to Halla, fearing the crash that might come. But the wrestler had a sudden revelation. There would be no crash. Tove had gained their friendship to be heard willingly. In those days, principles often led men to their deaths, but the 10th man was strong enough to keep his hand off his weapon and live to serve his cause. Aldrich was relieved and overwhelmed with admiration. "His luck obeys his will as the helm does his hand. I shall never worry over him again," he said contentedly, waiting in the courtyard for Tove to emerge from the feasting hall. Magnus overheard Thorkel's men praising Tove, and Eric's churls boasting about knowing him as a child. The tide was turning. "Tove Eriksson is an ingenious man. I take shame upon me that ever I doubted his wisdom," Halla said with unusual decisiveness. Einar grunted sullenly, always ready with a disagreeable remark. "Ugh, I do not agree with you. I think his behavior was weak-kneed. Knowing their hatred against the word Christian, all the more would I have dinged it into their ears that they might not think they had got the better of me. Now they believe he has become ashamed of his faith and deserted it." The 3 intruded upon him with a united fury. Aldrich asserted authoritatively, "Your words lack consideration, Einar Oscarsson. You neglect the fact that the crucifix still adorns his chest. How can they believe that he has abandoned or forgotten his faith when his god's emblem is visible to all?" Einar retreated in silence. Thorkel Farserk's celebration marked the commencement of numerous similar festivities. The arrival of autumn brought an increase of vessels in the fjords. Chieftains who voyaged to the northern seas to catch whales, trade with eastern nations, or partake in pirate sorties returned home with a surplus of wealth and news. Every family member, friend or visitor gave a welcoming feast, a lavish event that could sometimes last for 3 days. Tables were always full, horns always overflowing, with games, horse races, and gifts for all. In each of these festivities, Tove made an appearance in his magnificence, and his delicate eloquence earned him a revered position. His acceptance grew rapidly, his followers triumphantly increasing in tandem. Chapter 17. The Wooing of Hedwig. Love, the great force that has driven men to madness for centuries, remains a mystery to even the most learned scholars. A beautiful face can enchant even the wisest minds while leaving the foolish indifferent. We cannot blame others for their weakness in succumbing to the power of love, for it is a humbling force that can bring the most intelligent men to their knees. One day, a discovery changed Aldrich's view of the festivities around him. In November, while kneeling before his master to lace his high boots, he observed Tove preparing for a ride across the settlement. Haraldson sat with her back to her spouse, and Eric was in a foul mood, threatening to throw goblets at anyone who dared to look at him. The only others present were a couple of house thralls scrubbing at the lower end of the room. As he donned his fur gloves, Tove spoke of King Olaf converting Kjartan, an Icelander. Olaf had said, "The god I worship does not wish that any should be brought to him by force. As you are averse to the doctrines of Christianity, you may depart in peace." Kjartan, upon hearing this, replied, "In this manner I may be induced to be a Christian." Tove used this story to explain that men may be led by the nose if force is not effective. Ironbeard poked his head out to express his agreement, then snuggled back into his furs. Tove continued, describing how men had become curious about Christianity simply because he kept his promise to not speak about it. Ragnar Thorkelson also visited Tove, hoping to make a bargain concerning Hedwig. Aldrich's hand jerked so violently that the leather thong he held snapped, but his master continued on, unaffected. "I desire that my daughter be married as soon as possible, as she is unhappy sitting at home with Haraldson, and it isn't likely that she'll be any happier with me. I've thought about it at every feast, but no suitor has seemed good enough." The master spoke. Aldrich's mind came to a halt, feeling as if he was in a hopeless dream, and that such a plan couldn't exist without his knowledge. He held his breath, listening intently. The first suitor was too old, the second wasn't of good enough lineage, and the other two didn't have enough property. Ragnar Thorkelson has everything we're looking for. He's young, descends from a lawman, and has 18 farms and many ships, the master explained. Though he didn't understand why, Aldrich felt a fiery anger toward Ragnar Thorkelson, wishing to seek him out and eliminate him. Ironbeard looked at the group with a curious glance, stating, "However, I have never heard of him having any accomplishments in battle or defeating enemies." Tove agreed with Ironbeard, adding nothing further. There was a moment of silence until the sound of bells jingling in the courtyard grabbed their attention, signaling the arrival of the reindeer. It may have been unwise of me to refuse his bargain, but I didn't believe it would be in Hedwig's interest. I will wait until the next feast to make my decision. Tove finally spoke. Aldrich held back a chuckle, knowing the outcome. He knew it was foolish of him to expect anything different. He waited patiently for Tove to say more. The guardsman finished putting on his double fur jacket and walked toward the door. "Perhaps it was imprudent of me, or maybe it won't matter. The most suitable men come home late, and we haven't seen them all. The next feast will likely decide the outcome." After Tove had departed through a snowstorm of bells, Aldrich remained in solitude, frozen in thought, even as Ironbeard slept. "What troubles you, my son?" Ironbeard inquired with kindness. Aldrich snapped into consciousness and seized his coat, hurrying out the door without answering. "I must seek out Hedwig and tell her that it must cease," Aldrich murmured to himself as he stomped towards the women's house, struggling to formulate an excuse that would lure Hedwig to the door. Halfway across the courtyard, he ran straight into Halla. "Hail! Have you misplaced your eyes on the way here?" Halla jested, grabbing Aldrich by the shoulders and whirling him around in circles. "You seem just as bitter as yesterday's ale. What would you offer to hear some good news?" Aldrich grumbled, "Nothing, let me pass. I am in a hurry." Despite his resistance, Halla persisted, revealing the reason why Haraldson, a former colleague, had stopped talking to Eric and was now in a frenzy to obliterate things. "Why?" Aldrich asked hastily, no longer able to escape his grip. "Haraldson confessed to being Christian last night. Her chambermaid reported it to Hedwig, and when I encountered her—" "Where is she?" "Inside the women's house." Aldrich questioned, now captivated. Halla shook Aldrich violently by the shoulders. "Is that all you have to say? Do you not understand that now we have a chance to dominate Eric's men without contention? Once Haraldson transforms Eric in due time." "Say, where did you find Hedwig?" Aldrich bellowed. Halla released Aldrich and stood staring at him with an enigmatic grin. "If I were not your pledged companion, I might enjoy wringing your neck," he said. "I came across Hedwig at the portal hence. She was headed over to Glum Starkadson's for Haraldsson's belongings and to enjoy the hard snow underfoot." "Is it far from here? And which way must I go?" Aldrich asked. "Why do you ask? To what end?" Halla retorted. "I ask you which direction to take," Aldrich insisted. "The devil take you!" Halla gave in with a chuckle. "It lies to the north of the fjord, over a bridge that spans a river in a valley. And it's not far. Have you not yet learned that in Greenland folks don't ramble in the winter?" Aldrich pulled his hood over his cap, his cloak cinched tightly around him. He retrieved a pair of down-lined mittens from under his belt and donned them over his gloves. Without another word, he turned and headed to the gate. The weather was superb, dry and clear, the cold barely penetrating the fur-lined clothing. The snow covered everything fine and solid and dazzling. The even white expanse made him regret not bringing the skis he had been practicing with, but when he saw the line of rocks he would have had to circumvent, he was pleased he didn't. Way ahead loomed the sparkling wall of inland ice, a mysterious frozen sea that blankets all of Greenland, except its outer edge, neither advancing nor receding. What kept it in place, he wondered, and what lay beyond? And were the old women's stories true, about dreadful magical beings residing on its silent icy peaks? The sight of a dark smudge shifting across the pure plain far ahead erased every other notion. It might be Hedwig. He hastened his pace. He dove into the valley, lost sight of the dots, found them on the bridge, dove again, and lost sight of them once more. Only when he was within view of Glum Starkadson's enclosure did he get another glimpse of the smudge. But this time it was moving toward him, from the gateway. Sure enough, the lengthy red cloak and accompanying crimson hood conveyed to Aldrich that it was Hedwig who approached. With a single gesture, she acknowledged his presence. Her fair-skinned complexion radiated beneath the white fur border, and her eyes resembled two shining blue stars. Aldrich had never acknowledged how stunning Hedwig truly was, causing him to feel an unfamiliar shyness and rendering him speechless upon encountering her. Hedwig greeted Aldrich with cheer, remarking on the pleasantness of the air and the need for Haraldsson to run out of gold thread more frequently. "Are you in a hurry?" she inquired. Aldrich began hesitantly. Only for Hedwig to interrupt before he could continue. "Come with me for a brief moment, and I will tell you something of worth," she beckoned. He obediently walked beside her, contemplating how to convey his message. "Do you recall hearing of Einar's father Olaf?" Hedwig began, detailing how Gunnlaug Starkadsson learned that Olaf's horse had thrown him the night prior, proving fatal. "Do you not see what that means? Einar will become one of the wealthiest men in the settlement." Almost immediately, Aldrich grasped the implications. Einar would join the ranks of those whom Tove wished to bargain with, which left Aldrich feeling as if a hot iron singed his emotions, but for the life of him he could not find the words to express his outrage. After a moment's pause, Aldrich spoke gruffly. "I would be grateful if he would leave Tove's service, allowing me to converse with you without being monitored like a dog at a rabbit hole." Hedwig turned toward him, intrigued, questioning Einar's peculiar behavior towards her since meeting with Skroppa in Iceland 2 seasons ago. Aldrich looked wistfully out onto the snowy countryside, lost in thought. Finally he turned to his comrade and spoke absently. "The first time we met, he told me of Skroppa," Aldrich said, his curiosity now piqued. "Pray tell me, what is this Skroppa that he speaks of? Is she a creature, human or otherwise?" Hedwig cast a furtive glance around them before answering. "Skroppa is a wise woman who resides in the wilds to our north, living in a humble abode in a small hollow. Though Tove would never admit it, she was the one who eradicated the curse from Eric's sword." Aldrich felt a sudden burst of energy and saw this as an opportunity. "I wonder if it is within Skroppa's powers to tell us whom Tove will choose as a mate before the feasting is over?" he asked, somewhat harshly. Hedwig's eyes widened at the question. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, taken aback. Without hesitation, Aldrich laid out all that he had heard, flailing his arms in indignation as he spoke. He could not understand how Hedwig remained so surprisingly calm, her gaze fixed on the snow. When Aldrich had finished his passionate rant, Hedwig spoke calmly. Yes, I am aware of his intentions. That's why every time I attend a feast he gifts me with expensive jewelry, insisting on me wearing it. I have accepted his kindness, but let us not discuss it further," she said coolly. Aldrich was beside himself and took hold of Hedwig by her wrists, shaking her slightly as he gazed into her eyes with fierce determination. "You cannot let him choose your partner for you. You must swear by your sword that you will not allow it to happen. Do you hear me? I love you," he said ardently. Hedwig's expression changed dramatically, from annoyance to genuine pleasure as she took hold of his hands and shook them heartily. "Do you truly mean it? I am delighted, dear friend. I feel the same for you as I do for Magnus." Aldrich pressed her for a promise, his desperation evident. "Then swear it by your agleam blade that you will never accept his choice of partner." Hedwig pulled her hands away, speaking almost impatiently. "Why do you ask such a thing? It's pointless," she said, her tone firm. "But you've just told me that you have affection for me," Aldrich said, somewhat confused. The yoke of servitude weighed so lightly on Aldrich's shoulders that he almost forgot its existence. When he tried to ask, why, his status as a powerless slave came rushing back to him. He closed his lips, staring ahead with fiery, hopeless eyes, knowing he was no more than a worthless, helpless dog. Though I feel his pain, I cannot change his circumstance. Chapter 18, The Witch's Den. Moderately wise each one should be, but never overwise. His destiny let know no man beforehand. His mind will be freest from care. Yule Eve had filled the long, deserted temple on the plain with light and sound. Fires blazed upon the floor, and the row of gilded idols shone in all their splendor as the altars reddened with the blood of slaughtered cattle. The temple priest sprinkled the sacrificial blood over those who sat along the walls as they raised the consecrated horns and drank the sacred toasts. Eric of Brattahlid made a vow to render justice unto all men, whatsoever their transgressions, and his followers followed him in this, as in everything. However, because this was happening in the temple, Brattahlid was dark and gloomy. The great hall had no illumination save the flickering firelight, and was filled with black shadows. Tove leaned back in his high seat, scowling down into the flames. The women whispered in each other's ears, fearing to go near him now. Haraldson gazed at Tove, unseen, sometimes on his face and sometimes on the silver crucifix that shone on his breast. When the house thralls had cleared away the tables, they stayed in the corner, afraid to go forward and replenish the fire, even though gusts of bitter cold came through the broken window behind them. Unbeknownst to them, something other than the cold was making its way through the opening on the window. Even while they shuddered and dozed beneath it, a pair of grey Saxon eyes surveyed every nook and cranny with keen precision. As the eyes returned to the darkness beyond the window, Aldrich breathed a sigh of relief and whispered, "I am certain they haven't noticed that we've left." Suddenly Magnus's voice cut through the silence, barely above a whisper. "Is Kark present? I believe he's still in his corner. The lighting is terrible, and the flames are spreading, but I think I can make him out," replied Aldrich in a hushed tone. As they emerged from the shadows into the moonlight, it was clear from Magnus's doubtful expression that he was not convinced. "I think I heard the door creak after us, and I saw a shadow slip past us as we turned the corner. Kark is always on the lookout. It's entirely possible that our absence alerted his suspicion, and he's hiding somewhere waiting to track us. He's determined to catch you disobeying his orders more than anything in the world." Aldrich pressed forward relentlessly. The courtyard looked as deserted as a graveyard in the middle of the night. No sounds of horses or other creatures broke the stillness. As they moved towards the shadow of a storehouse, Aldrich quickly retrieved a pair of skis from a concealed spot and began putting them on. "Please heed my advice, Aldrich. I have a feeling that this will only lead to trouble if we involve ourselves with Skroppa. There will be no end to Tove's wrath if he—" Magnus trailed off as Aldrich interrupted him. "He won't find out. His mind is preoccupied with Eric's wrongdoings to notice my absence before I return. Furthermore, tonight is the only night free from Eric's henchmen spying on me. It's my only chance," Aldrich reassured Magnus. "Nonetheless, Kark may face the wrath of the trolls," Aldrich interrupted emphatically. "It's plausible that you could get caught up in this mess, and you're committing a grave sin. Harold Fayhair burned his own son alive for meddling with witchcraft," Magnus warned glumly. As his toes were secured by the straps of the runner-like skis, Aldrich stamped with irritation. "You needn't repeat yourself. I know just as well as you that it's a sin, but can't penance make it right? You will dishonor Tove's sacred mission. I won't cause a quarrel or offend anyone. What harm could I do?" Magnus placed his hands on his friend's shoulders, attempting to see his face in the darkness. "Please, comrade, give it up. If you're discovered, no amount of penance will make it right with Tove Eriksson." Aldrich replied slowly, "If he finds out what I've done, I'll accept any punishment he chooses. I owe him obedience while I eat his bread and wear his clothes. But I'm not his born thrall, so I'll have my way first. Don't urge me any longer, brother. My mind is made up." Magnus instantly released him. "I won't say another word, except that I intend to take that risk with you." Stooping into the recess, he pulled out another pair of skis and began to fasten them on. With the prospect of companionship, Aldrich felt a rush of relief, but then a twinge of guilt. "Magnus, you can't do this. There's no reason for you to put yourself in harm's way." "If I didn't accompany you, would you still call me your friend?" Magnus interrupted. "Do you think I'm a coward, letting you go alone where you might be attacked or killed? Do you have a weapon?" "Tove won't allow me to carry even a dagger, so tonight I took the old brass-hilted knife that Eric gave him in his childhood from his table. It's unlikely that he'll miss it. I have it here." Throwing back his cloak, he revealed the knife nestled in his girdle. "Let's go then," Magnus said brusquely, "and be careful with your skis. You're still learning." Taking up the long staff that served him as a balance pole, Magnus darted away across the snow-covered plains. Aldrich, a few paces behind, occasionally prodded his staff into shadows that seemed unnaturally dense. Leaving the courtyard by a side gate, they headed towards the fields where the snow was packed as hard as a roadbed. Their silent, bird-like movement was a reflection of their expertise at skiing. The young Viking, in particular, was an expert, zipping down hills at lightning speed, his skis perfectly aligned, his body gracefully bending, balancing and steering. Aldrich, on the other hand, had more difficulty, tripping frequently, his runners lapping one over the other and causing him to tumble until he was stopped by a snowbank. The two pressed on, daunted by the eerie setting. The night was frigid, with a wind that seemed to freeze the heart. The clouds were driven by a spiteful gust, making it difficult to see. When the moon shone brightly enough to guide them between great boulders, it would suddenly go out like a torch in the water. The gusts would wait for them at corners, leaping out and striking their faces with a scream that would make them shiver. The stillness between the gusts was even worse. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath in dread. They darted anxious glances at the glacier wall that glittered far ahead of them. Their tension was broken by a long, low wail that sent their hearts racing. They were walking by the edge of a dark ravine. Halting, they froze, staring into the blackness. The sound came again, even more piercing, before turning into a hiss, akin to a kettle boiling over. Aldrich laughed nervously. "Cats," he exclaimed. But Magnus's composure did not waver. "One of Skropa's," he responded. "It swarms with them. Look, is that a light down there?" A sudden flicker there certainly was, perhaps a ghost fire. The last cloud scurried away from the moon, revealing a cabin among the rocks. Aldrich checked his knife and slipped out of his skis. "That's her house. We'll leave the skis here." Magnus warned, "Though you never heed advice, we must go softly. If we find the door unlocked, we'll enter quickly and without knocking. Otherwise we may be outside talking to the stones." It was a tedious descent, but they arrived at the cabin without delay. The stillness was deathly, but the flickering light on the window spoke of life. Silently, Aldrich opened the door and they stepped inside. Darkness and a dying fire greeted them. Assuming the room was empty, they took a step forward. Suddenly, countless green eyes appeared in the darkness. Soft, furry bodies bounced against their legs, clawing and biting. The air was filled with yowlings and spittings. From the farthest corner, a toothless old woman spoke with a lisping voice. "Who dares interrupt my sleep when the visions of things I wish to know are passing before me? Better would it be for him to put his hand into the mouth of the Fenris wolf." Aldrich said, "It is the English thrall." After a pause, the voice answered crossly, "I know no English thrall." "How comes it, then, that more than a year ago you told something concerning him which made Einar Oskarsson his mortal foe?" Aldrich asked. Out of the darkness came a sudden cackling laugh. "That is true. I told the Black One that the maiden he loved would love an English thrall instead, and he wished to stick his sword through me." "Is that what you told him?" cried Aldrich in amazement. Magnus joined in the cry. Yet, as their minds ran back over Einar's strange actions, they couldn't doubt that this was the key that unlocked their mystery. From a hidden corner, a rustle and creaking were heard, followed by the soft sound of footsteps on the floor. A diminutive figure appeared on the edge of the shadows, beyond the dwindling fire. The light shone on small, grey, furry feet, causing Aldrich to think a monstrous cat had materialized. But as the flames surged upward, a furry cloak and hood came into view, along with a sharp yellow beak for a nose and a shaggy yellow protrusion for a chin. No eyes were visible. From within the shaggy recesses came a lisping voice. "When a slave of Tove Eriksson, who is also a Christian, risks his life and soul to consult me, I forgive being awakened at midnight. It's a testament to my power. Tell me what you want to know." Magnus touched Aldrich reproachfully, causing his cheeks to flush with shame. Nevertheless, he pushed forward. "I want to know if Hedwig, Gilly's daughter, is to be given to Einar. Whenever he talks to her from across the room, I feel as if knives are piercing me. I've endured it for 3 feasts, but I can't take it any longer. I love her so much. I'll dull those knives, just as Odin blunts the weapons of his enemies. Hedwig won't be given to Einar, who's too proud to ask for her since he knows she loves you instead of him," replied the Sibyl. Aldrich thought he'd feel content with that answer, but he had additional inquiries. "Will she be given to me then? How can I save her? How can I gain my freedom? How long will I have to wait?" The Sibyl bowed her head until her nose and chin disappeared, leaving only a furry, headless creature before them. There followed a long silence, as Aldrich nervously watched pairs of eyes appear and vanish silently in every part of the room, from floor to ceiling. Meanwhile, Magnus stood with his back against the door, struggling against heavy clumps that clung with teeth and claws to his cloak. Skropa raised her head and spoke hesitantly. "Thou dost ask too much, given the time and place. To comprehend all that with clarity, I would need to sit upon a witch's platform, consume witch's broth, and have maidens sing peculiar melodies. Spirits do not favor aiding those without music. I can only perceive fragments, dimly as if through a haze. I see thy body lying on the soil. I see a vessel where no ship hath been sighted previously. I see Tove Eriksson standing upon ground where no man hath stood before. 'Tis my belief that his countenance carries great fortune, and I perceive thee beside him, although thy appearance is not as it is now, for thy hair is lengthy and dark. The illumination is too brilliant for me to discern. There is one more vision available to me. I can see that it is in this new land that thy destiny shall be determined, whether it be auspicious or adverse." Silent expectancy followed her words. They had hoped for more, but it became clear that the prophecy was over. Magnus could no longer contain himself and burst into laughter, even though he was quite prudent. On the other hand, Aldrich erupted in a fit of irritability. "What is the meaning of this, you babbling woman? What exactly do you see? Inform me in plain words whether it portends good fortune or ill fate." Skropa retorted back with only a solitary word. "Babbling." Aldrich ignored her and continued to rant, while Magnus's laughter ceased. Something in that single word's tone sent shivers down his spine and caused every muscle in his body to stiffen. He squinted through the darkness, hoping to make out her movements, but it appeared to him that she had vanished. Where had she gone? In a sudden frenzy he fumbled for the door behind him and flung it open. It was fortunate that the moon was shining at that instant. "Aldrich!" he yelled. The man's yellow face was looming directly over the slave's unconscious form, and his ghastly claw-like hand was near enough to touch his cheek. What she could have done remains a mystery to this day. As Magnus voiced his warning, he grabbed his comrade and led him out of harm's way and towards the nearest exit. Agile as felines, they ascended the steep incline. As they neared the peak, Aldrich stumbled, and his blade tumbled from his person, striking against a rocky outcropping. Though it glinted in the dim light, neither of them paid any heed to it. They hopped into their skis and careened over the frozen terrain, with even the fastest caribou unable to match their velocity. Chapter 19. Tales of the Unknown West. Fire is necessary for survival, especially for those who are cold and weary from their travels over the hills. Food and shelter are also essential for those who journey through these rough lands. These are the teachings of Havamal, the ancient wisdom of our people. Aldrich spoke as his breath escaped in frosted puffs. He stood in Tove's chilly bedroom, pulling on his thick woolen stockings before venturing out once again in search of his lost knife. Magnus answered while huddled under a mountain of furs on the chest. "You've searched the ground 4 times already. It's unlikely that you will find your knife. Let it go." Aldrich sighed anxiously. "But what if Tove notices its absence?" Magnus scoffed. "It's been a week already and he hasn't noticed. And if he does, just tell him it was borrowed to protect yourself from wolves. Skropa is more wolf than human, so it wouldn't completely be a lie. Tove will understand." Aldrich nodded in agreement. "You're right. Tove was even talking about Christianity and how powerful it is. He believes that if he could perform a great deed, half of Greenland would convert. Magnus shivered and replied, "Yes, but we must focus on our immediate needs. Let us end this talk. I need warmth before my blood drops freeze solid." He descended the stairs, his movements stiff and jerky, as if trying to protect himself from the cold. He hopped and twirled around, beating his chest, before finally standing still to put on his skis. "Where should we go?" Aldrich asked as they skied out of the gate into the dim light of an Arctic winter day. "It might be risky to go over that road again. I caught Kark watching us with a smug grin that I would have wiped off his face if I weren't in a rush." Magnus promptly turned towards the snow-covered hills that separated them from Eric's fjord. "Then we'll go in a different direction today. That way any suspicions Kark has will dissipate. If Thorhall were home, he would have caught up to us by now. He's got a talent for spying with his green eyes." Maybe it was the mention of green eyes that triggered Aldrich's memory of the prophecy, or maybe it never really left his mind. After a while of skiing in contented silence, he suddenly spoke up. Perhaps there was some truth in her words after all. Magnus slyly moved his staff, causing Aldrich to trip and fall. "Indeed there was," he said solemnly as Aldrich got up and untangled his skis, "as evidenced by the fact that I see your body lying on the ground has already come true." Aldrich laughed, but his thoughts were serious. "I wasn't talking about that part. I was referring to what she said about a new unexplored land." Magnus's attention was immediately piqued, as if the very idea had been on his mind too. "It occurred to me that maybe she was talking about that western land you told me about. If I could escape there with Hedwig, I could save her and gain my freedom." Magnus's eyes lit up, only to darken again. "Yes, but that if is as wide as a mile-long rift in the ice. You'll never be able to cross it. Perhaps there is a way to overcome this obstacle. My mind will surely falter if there is no trail for me to follow, even if it is a faint one. Please share with me any other knowledge you have about this land." The wind carried them downhill at breakneck speed when Magnus suddenly jumped into the air with a shout. He landed on his feet at the bottom of the hill, unharmed. "By Michael, I can show you something even better than that. I know one of Bjorn's men, who is currently visiting Aron Bo Bender across the fjord. I heard Brand Knutsen talk about it last week. Well, Magnus, when chance brings such an opportunity knocking, I believe one should take it," Aldrich exclaimed. "Of course. Do you not see the sunlight still shining on the mountain peaks? It can't be more than noon yet. The only trouble is that the ice over the fjord may not be suitable for crossing. There's been a warm wind blowing for 3 days now, and even the ice up north where the seal hunters live sometimes breaks apart. Let me find our bearings. See the smoke in the distance? That's from Bratalid. And there are Eric's shipyards over there. Let's head in that direction. We'll reach a high point on the bank soon." They darted in that direction, gliding across the white plain. They found a group of reindeer belonging to Eric once, and not much else. Grey clouds hung low and obscured everything. Every so often they could hear the grinding and crunching of large masses of ice shifting around in the open water. The thunderous noise of 2 icebergs colliding briefly echoed in the distance. If there were any bears on that ice, they would have figured out by now that humans with spears are not the scariest things out there, Magnus joked. It is questionable whether Aldrich had heard the sound at all. He absent-mindedly replied, "Yes, and if we don't want to get straight to the point, we can always say we're cold and came to warm up." Magnus agreed, his teeth chattering like beads. "It's always true to say we're cold. I don't think Stark Otter was any colder when he stripped and sat in a snowdrift." It turned out to be even truer than they anticipated. They had scarcely left the shore and ventured onto the ice, when the gentle east wind became a gale that soon enveloped them in the blinding snowstorm. The ice became invisible a step ahead of their feet. They held on to their staffs, having left their skis on the bank, but even feeling their way with each step was hardly secure. It didn't take long for Aldrich to break through, up to his neck. If he was uncomfortable before, he was now drenched and shivering from the icy water. "If you get into this situation too, we're both done for," he chattered, once he managed to scramble out by lucky chance, with his staff falling crossways over the hole. "I'll keep going first. You save your strength to rescue us both when I'm too stiff to move." It proved a wise precaution, for just a few minutes later he broke through again, and it took all his companions' efforts to pull him out. By the time they reached the far shore, Aldrich had fallen in 4 times, and was so numb with cold that Magnus had to drag him up the bank and into Aron Bo Bender's hut. It was only a single low room, dark with smoke and grime, with the thick smells of old cooking and mouldy fur garments filling the air. Dogs were lying about, and there was a goat pen in the corner, but there was a roaring fire in the middle, a circle of hot drinks steaming around it, and behind them sat a group of jolly sportsmen who seemed to take no greater delight than stripping a stranger of his soaked clothes, vigorously rubbing him until he tingled, and filling him up with hot, spiced drinks. Returning that night was not an option for Aldrich, whose exhaustion prevented such an idea from even entering his thoughts, aside from a drowsy wonder as to whether punishment lay in wait, whether it be a scolding or a flogging for his unintentional absence. He forgot all about the man he had originally intended to see, the plump sailor snoozing across from him in the corner. Magnus, however, was not so disoriented. He also refused to face ridicule for his weather-related instincts by returning the following day. To avoid mocking, it would be prudent to bring someone back with us as a diversion, he concluded, and proceeded to formulate a plan. The next day, as they outfitted themselves in preparation for departure, Magnus brought up the festivities at Brattahlid. Instantly the sailor's eyes fluttered open like round portholes above his chubby face. The silver tongue rhapsodized about the culinary offering at Brattahlid, the freshly slaughtered cattle each week, the gammons and flitches which were taken from the larder, and the barrels of ale that were tapped for consumption. As Magnus stirred himself to leave and stretched out his hand towards the door, Grettir the sailor stood up from his corner. "Wait a moment, Jarl's son," he said, thick of tongue. "If it wouldn't displease you, I'd like to go with you." He gave a conciliatory nod to the group surrounding the fireplace. "Do not take offence, my shipmates, if I depart now, and allow me to thank you for your hospitality. The truth is that I've always had it in my mind to visit Eric the Renowned, if ever I should be in this part of Greenland, and now I have the chance with a guide. It would be foolish to miss this opportunity." "Your decision is respected, Grettir," Magnus politely responded, "provided you can keep up with us on skis." Grettir burst forth with a boom of laughter, and took for himself a pair of runners resting against the wall on a set of antlers. "You have a mischievous wit, Magnus Jarlsson. You assume just because I'm plump, I roll like a cask. I shall prove you wrong." Despite his size, he moved with a graceful motion that would make any seaman proud. Back then, even the landlubbers had a sense of how to work a boat, and sailors knew a thing or two about farming and horseback riding. He led them on a pace that left them gasping for air. The excitement of welcoming such a renowned figure to Brattahlid overshadowed any reprimands or curiosity. Once they got him anchored behind an ale-horn on the bench in the hall. All eyes were on him. In his good-natured and feasting state, he began regaling the household with his tales. "There is no one alive who can tell you more of the wonders of the western shore than I can, not even Bjorn Herjolfsson himself," he declared. And with that, he launched into the adventure of Bjorn's journey, from his blind leap into unknown seas to his eventual arrival on the Greenland coast. To hear of these strange and mythical lands from someone who laid eyes on them was more than just interesting. It was enthralling. The Jarl's sons listened intently as he wove his tale between sips. And then the fair wind stopped, and the northern winds brought fog that lasted for days. We sailed blind until we finally caught sight of the sun and could tell which direction we were heading. We set sail, and after a full day of sailing we finally caught sight of land. But when we arrived, we couldn't quite tell what it was. It was as unknown to us as this horn on the table. Bjorn insisted it wasn't Greenland, but he was still curious about it. The land had low hills and was covered in forests. We followed the coast for 2 days until we came across another land which was flat and wooded. Bjorn suspected it wasn't Greenland either, as there were supposed to be massive glaciers there. We wanted to go ashore, as we needed both wood and water, but Bjorn refused and ordered us to set sail back to the open sea. This time we voyaged for 3 days with a favourable southwestern wind and spotted more land. The elevated terrain consisted of mountains and a glacier, giving it an unwelcoming appearance. Bjorn conveyed his disapproval of landing on the island. However, we took a glimpse of the coastline and were certain it was Greenland, marking the end of our search for land. The team erupted into chatter. "Is that all we get from such a fine opportunity? It appears the gods have not blessed Bjorn Herjolfsson. Is he afraid, or what is his weakness? He's as dull as a wooden sword." It is unclear if this aligned with Grettir the Fat's personal opinion. Bjorn was a leader to him. Instantly the sailor sprang up in arms with a furious glare and knife in hand. "Bjorn Herjolfsson is not a coward. If anyone suggests otherwise, they will receive their punishment in blood." Eric was absent, allowing the situation to become chaotic. Arms opened in response to Bjorn's outburst. Tove stood up to address them in a serious tone. "Must I remind you all of how to treat a guest? Quick with hospitality and slow with judgment. Grettir, please join me and tell me more about your leader's journey." Grettir took his place honourably beside Tove. Magnus exchanged a silly look with Aldrich, who whispered, "I had the same notion when he called for Grettir. This must be fate's doing." Aldrich remembered a prophecy he had heard. "I shall stand beside Tove Eriksson when I'm standing on that ground." Chapter 20. Aldrich's Bane. Much goes worse than is expected in the blinding storm on Havamal. The wind still lashes fiercely and the sun has long set, leaving only the deceptive darkness of the falling snow. Aldrich rides along with his little Norwegian pony, struggling to keep moving forward. The driving snow is so thick that he can barely distinguish the outline of a house a foot away from him. "If I don't reach the gate soon," Aldrich shouts out to the shaggy pony, "I'll believe the fences have been snowed under." His mission was to locate a sailor that happened to be in the area and bring him to Brattahlid. Tove, the chief's consort, had become curious about the chief's voyage and wished to learn more. Aldrich had accomplished his task, now only with the need to return home. His appetite and warmth have taken priority. Aldrich spices up the conversation with the pony again, saying, "If we don't make it there soon, I fear we'll be riding over the roofs, not realizing we've passed the houses." Then suddenly 2 tall gates appear, and without error the pony turns down the left path towards the courtyard stables. The windows of the great hall, glowing with light, life, and warmth, bring Aldrich's heart great joy. He returns to the hall and begins to shake away the snow from his cloak, anticipating to see Tove. Jostled around by the busy house thralls carrying bowls and trenchers filled with food, Aldrich searches for her familiar figure while taking in the lively atmosphere she so often cultivates. As if every individual in the dwelling, excluding Tove, lingered on the benches, anticipating the evening repast. Eric stood adjacent to one armrest on his high seat, chatting cheerfully with Thorhall the steward. Haraldson leaned over the opposite armrest, swinging her keys while directing her housekeeper in regards to the food. Magnus and Hedwig played a game of draughts. In proximity, a sizable fur ball, revealing Ironbeard, was perched next to a chessboard. Solely Tove's cushioned seat remained unoccupied. With irritable force, Aldrich thrust his bearskin cap on his head and pivoted to re-walk his steps. As he turned, he noticed an item that Eric extracted from the steward and examined under light, the flames gleaming, causing Aldrich to identify the brass-hilted knife from a distance. Eric proclaimed with thundering laughter, resounding to all corners of the room, "I am confident it belongs to Tove. I granted it to him as a name fastening, and you obtained it in Skroppa's hideaway. This is an amusing development. In Skroppa's den, Tove the Christian. Ho, comrades Flein, Asmund, Adils, listen to this. No jester could create such a joke." He arose, gesturing with both arms, laughing boisterously. He noticed Aldrich's pallid face at the door and beckoned him also, illustrating a fresh burst of malevolent laughter. "And you, little priest-robed puppet, approach, so you do not miss a word. It will be fun for you, and for you, Haraldson, and the proud-headed Hedwig, even grey old Ironbeard. Listen, Greybeard, and learn even with one foot in the grave. Have you ever seen such an extraordinary game like this one played by your foster son with a stoic expression?" He was stifled by his laughter, causing his face to turn purple, and the entire household waited, leaning from the benches, nudging and whispering. The servants stared at the dishes in their hands, and Aldrich stood still by the door, motionless, as Magnus remained seated, still as the dead, in his spot. Rocking and stamping back and forth, the Red One finally caught his breath and bellowed out, "Tove the Christian in the den of Skroppa the witch! The proof is in the knife. Thorhall found it right outside her door. Such cunning! Comrades, behold! He must beg for help from Skroppa, he who pretends to despise her very name. He convinces us of a god he himself does not trust. Such a two-faced liar! Loki could not even come close to his fraud. This is great amusement for all." Continuing to shout with mocking laughter, his men nudged each other, chuckling and grinning while calling out taunts around the fire. Tove's men rose, seething with anger and humiliation, but were left speechless, unsure of how to deny or respond. Suddenly, Aldrich swiftly moved forward to where the light from the flames revealed him to everyone in the room and cried out hoarsely, "This is a lie! I took Tove Eriksson's knife to Skroppa the witch's den, no one else!" All movement and sound stopped for a moment, as if the sudden burst of cold air coming through the open door had frozen everything in the room. Then someone called out, accusing Aldrich of lying to protect his master, and Eric's laughter started up again, accompanied by more jeering. But Aldrich's voice rose above all. "Fools! Why would I risk my life for a lie? If you don't believe me, ask Magnus Sverrir. He knows I went there on Yule Eve to ask about my freedom. The knife fell from my belt while I was climbing over the rocks. Tove was as unaware as you. Ask Magnus Sverrir if you still don't believe me." Magnus stood up to speak, but found his tongue as dry as a withered leaf in his mouth, and all he could do was bow his head. Yet that was enough. Tove's men erupted into an uproar of victory that drowned out all the earlier jeers, making the rafters tremble with their rejoicing. Aldrich, at that moment, let out a deep breath as relief washed over him, knowing the lie wasn't his to bear. Though the light didn't leave his face, Tove stepped out from the shadows of the door and stood before him. She who said that the fire of Eric burned in his son's veins spoke the truth. The guardsman's face grew terrible, white-hot anger emanating from him. Death blazed in his eyes and was etched upon his face. Halla, Magnus, Hedwig, and even Valgar pleaded for mercy, but Aldrich understood the look that came from Tove's eyes. The action that followed was inevitable. Amidst the cries for mercy, Tove drew his blade, and with a quiver and a flash he brought it down upon Aldrich, cutting through fur, hair, flesh and bone. Aldrich fell, silent and lifeless, at his master's feet. To ensure all knew who dealt the killing blow, Tove threw his still-dripping sword beside the lifeless body and walked out of the room. An odd occurrence happened after Tove's departure. Hedwig ran over to Aldrich's lifeless form, cradling his wounded head in her arms while raining down tears on his white face. Haraldsson came in to take her away, but she cried out for all to hear. "Do you not understand? I loved him. I did not find it out until now. I loved him with all my heart, and now he will never know. I loved him." Chapter 21. The Heart of a Shield Maiden. The cattle wither, the family declines in number, we ourselves also perish, but the only thing that lives on is the reputation of the person who earned it. The vibrant awakening of spring was palpable outside, with snow melting away from the hillsides and new green life sprouting up from the flatlands. Edvarda's demeanor improved slightly as she walked up the lane with her face basked in the warmth of the sun. "It gives me the impression that it could dissolve my woes along with the snow," she ruminated. As she made her way through the gate, she spotted Tove's bunk resting high above, with Kark energetically ascending the steps, and her countenance faltered. "But some sorrow the sun cannot melt," she murmured. At the threshold of the grand hall, Haraldsson faced her with expectation. Inside the hall, all was a commotion: workers positioning tables and carrying in straw, maids setting embroidered cloths and hanging up celebratory tapestries. The matron's headdress was crooked, her cheeks flushed like poppies, and her keys ceaselessly jangled due to her skittish movements. "You lollygagging little wretch, you've taken so long!" she bellowed upon Edvarda's arrival. "I've checked more than 4 times for you. Was Astrid out of the house? Did you make the trip via Eric's fjord and learn who's sailing in?" The Saxon handmaid made a demure bow, a bit bashful, but the matron's preoccupation prevented her from noticing. "Lady, I was separated due to necessity. Astrid hadn't gone anywhere, yet she was uncertain about whether her son would sell his malt, so I had to wait until he came back from the stables." Grunted Haraldsson. "Einar Oscarsson has grown quite prominent since his father passed away and was given a burial mound. This is my 3rd time waiting for his permission." Her gaze turned sharply to the girl. "I believe you're not telling the truth about why you've been gone for so long. You're just using it as an excuse." Edvarda clutched at the door jamb, her face alternating between pink and white. "Lady, Haraldsson jabbed a reprimanding finger. "You never have to explain anything to me. She keeps you there to gossip about my household. Even though she's my friend, she gossips more than any other tongue."